Welcome to the Family Skeptical, Parenting Through Nonbelief.
We're a married atheist couple raising two wonderful, strange children. We ask big questions, dissect weird parenting moments, and examine how society ignores or misrepresents families like ours. If you're any stripe of non-believer who's involved in raising children, welcome. You are our people.
Hey, Pops.
Hey, moms.
I feel like we're entering another podcast, just like
Completely unhinged, frazzled, unprepared for life, socks on backwards, hat on backwards. Basically, we're crisscross.
Yeah, it's so it was Reader's 9-year-old birthday party this morning. So we basically rushed back and just like
We're here. We're here.
It's all good. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was something I'd actually wanted to discuss earlier, didn't quite know the context to bring it up. And then when I was thinking about recording, I realized that it really plays into our discussion of intuition in the last episode.
Interesting.
So I feel like in that one, it was hard to come up with like a really good personal example of what I was talking about when I said that intuition kind of like helps me know when I need to think about something more. And I realized that this thing I'd sort of wanted to discuss was a really good example of that. So I was listening to Thank God I'm an Atheist, which is probably my favorite atheist sort of themed podcast out there. Great show. A couple of weeks ago, they read a letter from one of their listeners, and it was about conservative churches that discourage women from working. And the letter writer's opinion was that they do that because that makes families less financially secure. And then they are dependent on the church, and it gives the church sort of leverage and power over them.
That's their assertion.
That was the assertion of the letter.
Okay, got it.
That was what the letter writer was asserting is the reason for that.
Got it. Asserting. Yes.
Yep. And so I was listening. I was like, yeah, okay. And the host sort of thought it was interesting. And then I was thinking about it, and just something did not sit right with me. So it was one of those things where it's sort of like, it sounded fine. Like there wasn't anything about it where I was like, well, that's just radically wrong. Because certainly there are churches who use their philanthropic outreach as a way of also converting people. So that, there are lots of examples of churches where they have a food kitchen, but if you come, you have to pray first before you get the meal. Like that is a thing. So I understood where the letter writer was coming from. But I just got that thing in the pit of my stomach where I was like, I don't think it stands. Like, I think there's something wrong with this argument, as much as I appreciate where the person is coming from. So that's kind of an example of where my intuition was like, I think you gotta, before you take this on as like an idea that you think is right, there is more thinking to be done here. And I don't know if I'm right, but when I thought about it, I think what the letter writer was ignoring is that all churches need to make money. Like I think about the church that you grew up in that has had real financial problems, even staying solvent and active. So for smaller churches, there's like a constant issue of having enough money to operate. There's a synagogue near us that I follow because when we moved here, I realized that every other time in our life, we were living around huge Jewish populations, and now we're not. And I
No, we are not.
Started to feel very lonely, so I started researching synagogues. But I sort of followed their emails, and we've done a couple online things with them. But they also were thinking about merging with another synagogue because they've had issues with cash flow. So for small churches, money is always an issue. And then for large churches, I feel like money is the point for a lot of large churches. I'm not saying it's the only point, but it is up there.
Yeah, it feels, and I know it feels crappy to have me say this, knowing, what I've already said about anecdotal evidence and arguments from intuition, but it feels like there's very little middle ground. Like it's very polarized. You're either a church that is really well-meaning, but is, not necessarily as well off, or you're very well off as a church because the focus is making money, and you find ways to drive up membership in service of that. Like, and I don't know if that, I don't even know if that holds. Now that I'm saying that, but I have heard so many stories, especially as America becomes a more and more secular nation, of churches that are having to merge, having to close down, because they just don't have the ability to pay their leases. And and it's a shame because, like I've said before, I specifically am not an anti-theist yet. I think that once we get to a certain point of stability culturally and politically, I'll feel safe being an anti-theist. But at the current moment, I feel like culturally and politically, we need to sort of batten down the hatches, circle the wagons, insert metaphor here, for everybody who is similarly culturally and politically minded, to like stop the rise of Christian nationalism and fascism. I think that is more important, because I feel it does me no good in the long run, or my children no good in the long run, for me to take a hardline stance against all Christians or whatever, simply because, I don't think that religion ultimately has enough usefulness to keep it around. Like the things you get out of it could be gotten from secular means and without all the baggage. But at the current moment, I'm shelving that in favor of what I would consider to be the greater good. And so I lament that those smaller churches that seem to be more community minded are having such a hard time, because those are the ones that I think honestly would be forces for good. People where people do need help and support, where they would use the resources of the community, and they would need a community that's robust enough, that's well off enough to be able to help support them in their time of need.
And I agree with you. I think the dichotomy I drew was probably too strong. So there were probably some larger churches.
It feels right, though, because we all dislike Joel Osteen. So it feels right that there are good churches where the nice Christians we go. And then there are Joel Osteens of the world.
But I think the point I was trying to make is just all churches have to be concerned with money.
Yeah.
I don't know of any church where they are just so, well,
if they own their land and they own their building, that goes a long way towards them being able to weather any sort of financial difficulties. But for a lot of churches, those are big buildings. They don't own the land. They don't own the buildings. They're paying money every month. And then there's the overhead of all the staff. So you can minimize it as much as you want. And so like with a smaller church, you could have the music director, you could have some minimal office staff, and you could have the preacher, pastor, whatever you want to call that, the person. And if it could be, you could strip it down to bare bones and actually, make it work at a reasonably tight budget.
Yeah, but I think there are very few churches where they can just be like, we're going to make everybody dependent because then we can just support them. Like, I don't think that's actually a thing happening, even for the wealthiest of churches.
Yeah, that seems like a weird read. It seems very much like the caller, the writer was, they did have an axe to grind, and understandably so. It's very easy to see, because we see stories all the time of people who have been, harmed by their religious experiences and upbringing, and that they have that perspective that is theirs by right, but isn't necessarily clear.
And like I said, I can understand how he got there.
Mm-hmm.
Like it ties into things that are really happening. I just don't think it's happening in that case. And then I was thinking about why churches would really support women staying at home if they care about bringing in funds or having financially stable families.
Right.
And here's where I don't know, but like my gut is like, oh, because they care about subjugating women more than any of those other things.
Yeah, I mean,
Like,
I would go to that because you have actual Bible verses about, women being essentially property with the Ten Commandments. The actual language puts women in the same breath as cattle, literally. And the whole thing with rape victims and marriage and you know basically daughters are property of their fathers, and the women not being encouraged to speak out in church or to be able to preach or all of it. Yeah, the patriarchal nature of the early Hebrew society looms large to this day.
yeah. And to me, it's just one of those cases where you can just clearly see that that is what they care about more. And I think it's that
Yes.
simple.
Yep.
So it was an interesting case. But it's one of those things where it's like, if I hadn't gotten that like feeling, I don't think I ever would have taken the time to sit with it and try to think through it. I probably would have, just been like, yeah, churches do kind of use weird means to like get people to keep going. And, so
Yeah.
I don't know. It was just interesting because I'd wanted to talk about it, and it seemed a really good example of that thing where it would be easy to just kind of overlook and be like, interesting point.
No, I mean,
keep going.
yeah, but that's the thing is you could have some churches that like use the Pentateuch as metaphor. They use the broad strokes versions of the Ten Commandments. But then that, it's so in that sense, they are using the Bible to be open and inclusive, to think more about actual justice and not about like Old Testament version of justice. And then you have the people that actually like go into like looking at every quote unquote jot and tittle of scripture. And they go to like Exodus 20 and they're like, don't covet your neighbor's house and wife and male servant or female servant or ox or donkey or anything that your neighbor owns. And, we live in 2022 and women do all the things and can do like all the things. And it doesn't make any sense to hold society back by taking some of the people that are best suited to do the things they're doing and push society forward, simply because religious reasons. Let's be kind. But hey, but what else has happened since the last podcast is those like morality police in Iran are apparently getting disbanded in the wake of all the protests over the woman being killed for not wearing her religious clothing correctly.
Well, I've heard
I don't know
mixed
if that's
things about
actually going to
it.
happen. I know
It's unclear how far they're going to go, but
it's at the very least, it's a step. Before they weren't even paying lip service. They were like, oh yeah, we have morality police, deal with it. Now they're actually like being forced to deal with it themselves. So it is a step in the right direction. Yes, I am not holding my breath for Iran to going back to before the revolution.
Indeed. So that is sort of an interesting lead-in to the other topic, which is finishing up our series on education by talking about history.
Yeah.
And I realized I was sort of trying to avoid this one.
Okay.
Because, so there are many people in my life who really love history. My dad, your dad. And this is one of the places where I feel like I'm sort of a failed person. Because I am really fascinated by history, but I don't read it. Like I love hearing about the stuff they talk about. And there are some history books that I've really loved, my understanding is like much more from sort of, I don't know, like a mix of things and historical fiction. And I feel like if I was a better, smarter human being, I would just be reading history all the time because I really do think it's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
But it's one of those things where, like, if it's not a well-written history book, I kind of tap out. And
Okay.
I find it hard to figure out which ones are going to be the really well-written ones
Mm-hmm.
and which ones aren't. And therefore, I just kind of
You've
ignore them
given
all.
up.
I've
Yeah.
given up.
Always a good tactic.
Yeah. No, it's no, it's not. This is why I'm failed. This is why I'm a failed human being. Like, I feel like if I was better and smarter, I would have figured this out by now. Because at every time in my life, I'm like, oh, I really wish, like, I should be researching this, or like, I wish I was doing this. And I keep thinking I'm going to do it for the kids. I'm like, oh, because of X, Y, and Z, like, we could be reading all about this. And I just don't do it. I just totally don't do it. Maybe at some point it'll change. But I'm always like, yeah, but I have fiction and a graphic novel to read.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, you can't stop the podcasts.
And no, that's not an option. So,
Yeah.
so in some
It's
ways,
okay.
I feel
you've chosen your path.
I have, but I haven't. I've just failed to do what I actually want to do.
But that is a choice.
Well, yeah, this is no, yes. So
Yeah.
in that way, I feel totally unqualified to talk about the teaching of history.
Great. Let's talk about history then.
Let's talk about
its
history.
Teaching.
So what I do want to do is just sort of talk about 3 things that have happened in my life that have made me think about how we teach history. And then we can just close it out there, or if you have other stuff to talk about, we can build on it. But I don't feel super confident making pronouncements, but there are some things that have made me think about it differently. So
Okay.
I think one of my issues with history, and I think something that made me less enthused about it as a school subject, is that a lot of history is taught just as, here's what happened, and you need to remember it.
Mm-hmm.
And that is an interesting way to teach history, because it's a thing, and it's like certainly good to know about what came before and to have context for the world and all of that. So I don't want to minimize that in any way, shape, or form. But when you think about what actual historians do, it is a totally different project. And I wish we included more of that. And I didn't quite even realize it until at some point. So my dad loves history, and I would say mainly European history and sort of medieval to the present day. And he's a guy who is a real Richard III supporter. So does not believe that Richard III killed the princes in the Tower. And that was kind of, as a kid, where I started realizing this disconnect. Mm-hmm. Because once, and again, he like gave me all these great books about that. And at multiple times I've sort of written about it. And I've like, maybe I read them for one project, but it's like always just been based on the stuff he told me. Like I never really dug into it myself. Anyways, but hearing about that, I was like, oh, this isn't we don't know all the answers in the past. Like this is something that we have to investigate, and it's somewhat of a mystery. And we're going on these historical texts that are biased and complex. And that immediately made it a much more interesting question to me.
Yes.
But until college, I feel like that sort of investigation of history, what historians actually do, like looking at original texts, sort of trying to do original research,
They
Like
look at it like a
never,
mystery.
yeah, like that
It's really
never.
cool. Like to be an actual historian where you're like, I really want to get to find the kernel of truth, or to discover this person's true intentions, or to, finally solve this centuries old mystery. Like all of that, they're investigating. And there are parallels you can make with the scientific method. Like they have a hypothesis. It could be something along the lines of, what we know. I am convinced that what we know about this event or this person isn't complete or isn't accurate based on this thing that I have found. And then you go and you set to prove or disprove it by looking for corroboration, looking for external sources, if you can, interviewing people, like cross-referencing it with other texts or archaeology. It's so fascinating that it really, I think, for like high school level, that it should be a thing. Like high school kids, in my opinion, in history classes, shouldn't just be made to memorize, rafts, reams, rivers of facts and dates and names, genealogies, chronologies, geographies, all of that stuff. That's, I guess, that's fine at a certain level, but the craft of the historian is something that I think, if when appreciated, just like teaching the scientific method or logic, when appreciated, can lead kids to feel emboldened and not settling for things they're told. So again, guiding them towards a greater degree, a more refined degree, or maybe even a slightly different flavor of skepticism, but reinforcing skepticism, validating it, showing them that, oh yeah, in this other way, it's also very useful. I would say critical. Because what is the adage about like not learning from history, doomed to repeat it,
Mhm.
right? There's truth to that, because a lot of things have happened in the past. A lot of things are going to happen in the future. And woe betide the person that isn't able to see parallels and predict what might happen, planning for the disasters that could come. I just
But
think
I
it's
think,
critical. I think it'd be super cool to have, just like the other
and
stuff we've
wouldn't it
talked
be
about.
more fun?
It'd
Like
be so fun. I
I
love
feel,
memorizing stuff. I can memorize stuff. I'm one of those lucky people that has like a stupid memory that can just memorize shit. Sorry,
yeah.
stuff. But like understanding that not everybody can do that. I don't think that the way history is generally taught at the high school level is super helpful for people. But also, what do people gain from knowing how many islands there are in Venice? What, like when Savonarola was put to the stake? Like what does that do for a person, as opposed to appreciating truly from a first person perspective what historians do and why what they do is so critical, so that no matter what you do with the historical knowledge you gain or are taught, you appreciate it more, and you appreciate what it took to get it to you into your head. There, like, that appreciation, I think, is in some sense more valuable, because that is a heuristic. That's like, it's the shorthand you can use for deciding what would be valuable. When you learn something, oh, I'm learning something about history. If you don't actually appreciate what it took to get that codified, right, in a book, then and have it be reviewed by your peers, and have people say, yeah, you know what, I'm going to quote this because this is well researched and thorough and a compelling read, right? Like that, then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I might disagree with the conclusions, I might not fully understand some of the events or the people, but I really appreciate what it took to put this together. That it isn't dismissed as a class that you have to take. That it's an actual validated field of study. Wouldn't it be cool if more kids became historians? I think
Yeah.
so.
And I hadn't thought about this, but I think the huge interest in genealogy
Mm-hmm.
like shows how much people actually like doing this.
That's just the Mormons and all their websites.
I mean, there probably is other websites, but I know tons of people who do it.
It's really cool.
Yeah.
Especially now that we can do genealogies using genetics and, cross-referencing stuff with, documents at Ellis Island or ship manifests or whatever. It's really cool. It's like the golden age of genealogy. I just worry that, sometimes people are desperate for answers and they can end up paying for services that don't necessarily supply valid ones.
Yeah. But, when I started thinking about the kind of stuff you could do, it could be this amazing, because when we were talking about logic, I was like, I don't know how you do this well. This is one where I think it would be so easy to do it well, because it could be so many things. Like it could be interviewing older members of the community to get their stories.
Yeah.
About certain times. It could be, researching something in the community, because the thing with history is so many people research big events that everybody cares about, but smaller things often get overlooked. The histories of smaller communities don't always get researched because there's just not the people to do it. So I feel like everybody could find something where kids could go out and do some original research and understand more about the place that they live and the people that they live with. And it could be really cool.
Mm-hmm. I just got inspired to do a magnificent low budget horror movie I'll tell you about later.
Okay.
Thank you, by the way, Podcastville. You gave me a script idea.
Yeah. So there was that. And then much more recently, two things happened that made me think about this again. So
Please.
We were watching the Next Generation Star Trek movie, which was the one?
Which, I don't know, which one were we?
We've only watched one recently.
I mean, we've seen more than one of the Next Generation Star Trek movies. Are you thinking of First Contact with James Cromwell and Zefram Cochrane? Okay.
Yeah, First Contact. So in that,
come on along with me, little girl, on a magic carpet riding. You don't know. Sorry. He's so good in that movie.
He is,
as being so goofy and like surprising Geordi by not being who Geordi expected.
Well, that's what I wanted to talk about. That's what I want to talk about. So
they made a statue of me, and he just walks away in a huff. Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot happens in that movie. The important thing is that the crew goes back in time and ends up connecting with the guy who created the spaceship that went into space and made first contact with an alien life form, which led to
humanity's first warp drive.
Yes, which led to the whole founding of the Federation and everything.
First contact with the Vulcans. Yes.
Yeah. And he is this like huge figure in history. And this is a moment that people study and venerate. And like you said, there's statues to it. And they go back and the guy is kind of like he's a drunk. He is just a messy human being who happened to make a great spaceship with the help of some people you can see who like probably were not venerated in history.
Alfred Woodard.
And the woman.
Alfred Woodard, yeah.
Oh, wait.
Okay, always sorry. Good as everything. Good in everything.
Yeah. And it's just, again, another thing where I'm like, man, everybody should watch Star Trek with their kids because it's this great lesson in the fact that we learn about people in history and we only learn about their most amazing accomplishment. And we are very rarely encouraged to think about them as the full messy human beings that they were. There are certainly some exceptions to that. There are some more complex characters who are sort of who people are really interested in for their complexity. I think JFK is like that, Churchill to a lesser degree. So this isn't 100% true, but I think for a lot of people, like we just focus on what made them a historical figure. And people don't think a lot else. And so to me, it was this great reminder of like, yeah, like everybody's got their messy stuff happening, and everybody is complex. And like most people we think about, probably there's this whole level of them that we just never acknowledge. And then to like blow that out, it's a graphic novel called I Know What I Am, The Life and Times of Artemisia Gentileschi. Think I'm saying that right? Could be mispronouncing it. And it's a graphic biography of a pioneering woman painter in 17th century Rome. And her story is super fascinating, tragic, all sorts of stuff. But the thing that blew me away about this book is it's the time kind of right after Caravaggio, right? And you look at those paintings and they're gorgeous and rich, and everybody's in these like amazing dresses. And it just feels like this kind of opulent time. And I'm reading this book and the painters who were making those paintings, they were going around in gangs. They were shivving painters who like stole stylistic elements from them. There were bar fights. People killed each other. There was backstabbing. And to me, it was this moment, because I don't like to think about history as like a staid thing, but it was this moment of like, oh yeah, like when we think back about the past, sometimes it feels like when we're living is particularly messy because we're in it and we're seeing all the complexities of it and experiencing all the good and the bad. But it was like, oh yeah, like every time in history is messy. And to think about these beautiful paintings being made by people who were acting like
misanthropes.
Yeah. It was just, it made me realize that often, even when I think about the past, I don't fully think about it with sort of the breadth and depth of what times are like now, which of course it had, but it's just easy to forget.
Makes me think about, years ago, I started getting my mom nonfiction and historical books for holidays, birthdays, whatever. And, a number of them were very specifically not about events. They weren't about people. They were about, like, one of them was called Salt, which was the history of our relationship with salt. And so by analyzing salt and our relationship with it, you touch on so much of human civilization.
Oh, yeah.
The mining of it, using it as a preservative, the relative wealth a person would need to have it and use it in certain ways, how it's used industrially, it's just so many different aspects of it that is so fascinating. And it made me think how interesting, when you wanted to talk about this, that I thought about that and how interesting history is when you use that sort of specific lens. And like we said at the top, history can be really interesting. You just need to be encouraged, to be brave enough to find an interesting perspective and to not just say, oh, I need to investigate this place. I need to investigate this person. I need to investigate this event. And that's part of history. But another really big part of history is seeing the web of interconnectivity where others might not. And like a good investigator, right? You don't have to be like Charlie Day and having like a corkboard with 1,000 items on it pinned and like you red yarn crisscrossing the room to where you can't navigate. But to see a web connecting events and people and things and places makes for and not only an interesting analysis, but from the reader's perspective, something that's actually memorable and something that makes you not just respect the individual historian and writer, but to respect the craft as a whole. Because that's not something that the average person wakes up in the morning and says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to write a book about salt.
Mm-hmm.
But a historian would look at that and be like, wow, wait, what, we could talk about this, we could talk about that. And we could go back all the way to when we first started agrarian society, like when we started using tools to mine and we discovered that certain minerals had certain qualities. When did that happen? Right. And then all of a sudden you see they're like a little kid in a candy store. They don't know where to begin. History is really effing cool. But I think it's taught more like, generally like a biology class with less hands-on. Memorize this list, test. Memorize this genealogy, test. Let's read this book and let's talk about it. Okay, great. I was fortunate in my high school to have a great history department.
Mm-hmm.
And the history teacher there, he was a magnificent fellow, super cool, very knowledgeable, very like a perfect dry wit that you would want in a high school history teacher to have.
Mm-hmm.
We read a book called Home. Home is a great book, especially for like a high school student, very digestible. It's the history of home, of the idea of habitation, right? Because we forget that it wasn't too long ago that we cohabitated with our farm animals, to where one of my friends made the joke, you know who I'm talking about, made a joke in class, bring in the goats. And to which that became like an in joke for us to this day.
Mm-hmm.
Bring in the goats. But that's how engaging that book was. That book, not, Europe, like medieval European history textbook, a book that was a cross-cultural analysis, looking at one specific aspect of human experience and seeing this web, charting the changes, seeing what remains, and seeing how it helps us understand ourselves and our relationships today. It is really cool. And so those sorts of books become more like stories and less like work. And they're very engaging because you find yourself connecting to the experience, right? And I think that if more weight was placed in that sort of that aspect of history education, I think we'd have a lot more kids who are as excited about history as I am, my dad, your dad, you are fundamentally.
Yeah.
And I want my kids to be too.
No, I too had a really good social studies teacher in high school.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the best classes I took with him was history of Africa.
Okay.
And he decided to structure that course around breaking down the elements that kind of explain why certain things are happening in Africa today.
Yes.
And so
that's cool.
as much as it wasn't sort of, having us do our own original research,
mm-hmm.
to approach history more from that aspect of like, can we figure out why something is happening?
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to just
fun.
like, here's what happened. But like, what are the elements that led us here? And looking at all the terrible things that colonialism did and how that
mm-hmm.
really impacted the infrastructure of countries to be really useless for the people living there and only helpful for the people extracting wealth from those countries.
Yeah.
And all sorts of different things.
Can we use this road? No, you can't use this road. You can use that road over there. That's not even a road. It's just dirt
all
path.
the roads just go to the coast.
Yeah.
Like that's where they go because we're just taking things and we're taking them to the coast and taking them away. So it's not really a useful inter-country system. And, certainly some of those things might have been revised, but that too, I think in a similar way was like, oh, this is a way to think about things. Like this is a structure for figuring things out, not just for, imbuing oneself with facts.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a great course. Really cool.
Yeah. As I get older, I'm increasingly less impressed by facts as like something to memorize or concern yourself with in some sort of like organized capacity. Like obviously facts are important because they help to support, underpin belief, right?
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, like as a storyteller, as a parent, as I get older, I appreciate stories and perspectives more.
Mm-hmm.
And I care more about who is telling me this history. I more so in some case than I care about what the actual story of the history is. Because we are, as you say, we're all people. We all have baggage. That person that cut you off on the freeway, their brother could have just gotten hit by a train or whatever. You don't know what's going on in their head. They could be a doctor who's late for a surgery and they need to get there super fast, but something happened. They weren't able to get on the road in time. You never know. Similarly, you don't know who's writing this history. You don't know what was happening in their life when it was happening. Like we should have a class on histories about historians. How far can it go?
That's a fascinating idea.
It'll be an infinite regress of investigations. Then you're investigating yourself doing the investigation. Where does it end?
Oh, that's the best though.
But I think we can kind of end it there. That was really cool.
So I wanted
Thanks, Moms. That was great.
Yeah.
Did you have anything else you wanted to add to it?
Yeah. Nothing to that. I just want to say this is the final episode of 2022. Aww. So I know we did it. We did this for most of a year.
Yeah.
It's wild. Granted, the first one took me 3 months to get out. So it doesn't seem like we've done it for most of a year, but for us, it's been most of a year. So for 2023, I don't know if I'll have things together for the first couple of episodes, but hopefully we will have better audio. I'm researching a couple of things. So if people have been irritated by the quality, it should be slightly better. And I have
Bob's
a little
quietly raises his hand. I know I'm a jerk. You love me.
And also I have a little project for myself where I want to do a little bit of a dive into Christian parenting advice. And I have no interest in exploring the just blatantly awful advice that is out there. I'm sure there are people.
We're not going to talk about trad wife TikTokers. Can we talk at least a little bit about trad wife TikTokers?
I still have to watch that video.
They're so entertaining.
Yes.
In all the worst ways. They're
yes.
It's like a slow moving train wreck.
Yes. So we can definitely do that because that's fun. But I am much more interested in finding some sort of interesting religious parenting advice. So
great.
That is my quest for 2023. I hope to bring some of that in some of the next episodes. And I just hope everybody has a wonderful holiday and Happy New Year.
Yeah.
And as always, we need to thank Jonathan Zalbin and First Frame Music for the music for the show.
And that wraps up this final 2022 episode of The Family Skeptical, where nothing is sacred except for our kids.